Hello and welcome to Raw Politics, Newsroom's weekly podcast and video chat on the big political issues. You may be confused. We are out a day early. Of course, it is Matariki weekend coming up, so we decided to come to you a little bit earlier. I'm Jo Moyer and I have with me my colleague Mark Dalder. Hello, Mark.
Hi, Jo.
And in Auckland, we have Tim Murphy. Hello, Tim.
Hello, Jo. Hi, Mark.
Today we're going to take a look at the two political polls out this week, and then we'll examine the deputies of the two major parties and how their performance is going in the lead up to the election. As always, we will wrap up with a few recommendations. So first up, we're going to have a look at the Talbot Mills poll and the Taxpayers Union Courier poll that have both come out in the last couple of days. Interesting polls in the sense that there wasn't a obvious trend out of them. Just to give you a bit of an idea of where things landed with those polls, bearing in mind, of course, Talbot Mills is Labour's traditional pollster and Courier is National's traditional pollster as well. We had with Talbot Mills lowest in 4 years for Labour, that poll. Pretty interesting figures there. Labour was down 5 points to 31. National was up 1 to 36, so getting into that 5-point margin sort of terrain. ACT was up 1 to 12 and the Greens were up 1 to 8, Te Pāti Māori sitting on about 4. So that, of course, left the situation where National and ACT could comfortably govern there. Moving into the Taxpayers Union Courier poll, hung parliament basically. National 33, Labour 31, they were both down a little bit, and we had ACT up on 13.2, which I'm sure you'll have things to say about, Tim Murphy, and the Greens down a little bit on 8.9. Te Pāti Māori, interestingly, holding at 5% in that poll. So, Tim, let's go to you first. I mean, no obvious sort of trend there, very different situations, bouncing around a lot still as we get to a couple of days out from 3 months until the election. What's your assessment on these?
First, that, you can't rely on any one poll. So if we need an illustration of that, it's that one day we have, one result, the next day equally reputable, although politicised, I guess, poll shows something a bit different. But you can't also target the pollsters. I noticed after the Talbot Mills poll came out that there are a lot of critics from the left, the very partisan left on social media, attacking this poll and the pollster for doing it for corporates and getting this result that's selling out the Labour Party. And this is Labour's, contracted pollster in other polls. Similarly, as you said, Courier does work for the National Party, and they haven't evidently tried to gild the lily here, as they don't. So just that's a point about interpreting polls. I think it's interesting, though, that the hung parliament remains the most likely result for election night, and the Māori Party may well be the most interesting result of all here. ACT is amazing at 12 in one of those polls, but for the Māori Party to be up to that point of near 5 and the number of MPs they will bring and the possibility that they save the left bloc's bacon in the end is really interesting still.
Yeah, I mean, increasingly it is a situation where the minor parties are the ones to watch and to look at here with, National and Labour sitting on numbers that in previous years, leaders have said that they would walk and leave the leadership over those sorts of numbers. Interested in your thoughts, Mark, covering the Greens quite closely and ACT as well. What's your take, I guess, on how they're sort of positioning themselves, how much leverage they may or may not have, and how that's kind of influencing the way that National and Labour are thinking at the moment too?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really does seem like the parties with the ideas, with the policies, are the minor parties, the ones on the wings. You've got, ACT with a range of policies, quite a comprehensive alternative budget and tax policy. The Greens obviously have their wealth tax, which Chris Hipkins has just said, he's not going to go ahead with any sort of wealth tax or CGT. So it does feel like, the big parties are scrapping it out in the middle to do not very much, and the little parties are the ones coming up with the ideas, which means the way the campaign is shaping up is that the big parties are using the little ones to beat each other. Labour's attacking National National by saying it will have to implement ACT policies because it will need ACT to govern. But likewise, National has the same sort of rebuttal to Labour and on the Greens and on the Māori Party as well. So, it's quite a different dynamic, certainly from last time, but even from some of the previous elections where there have been pretty strong major parties.
Do you think too, Tim, that it's kind of the way that the polls are working and given what Marcus just said there with ACT and the Greens and the way that they're kind of using any potential leverage, it is having an impact on National and Labour and the way that they're operating? Because if you sort of pull it all back, it really feels at the moment like Labour is kind of just going around ruling out all of these things they're not going to do, and National's going around saying, here's all these things that is currently happening that we're going to scrap if we're in government. And I'm just sitting here going, what exactly does National and Labour currently stand for?
I think, Joe, you can give National a few more ticks than Labour. They have proposed some new things. Labour is just playing within itself, waiting, it seems, to bring things out. Now, Mark, you mentioned the tax policies. This thing this week, the revelation that pre-budget they had some analysis done and had some consideration of a wealth tax and a capital gains tax, is astonishing politics, really. It shows to me that it's a party that's uncertain, a movement that's uncertain about what it's really aiming to be and do. You could say, well, of course they should consider these things, but then to consider it and then come out and make a virtue of having rejected it seems to me to be quite an unusual sort of approach. I was taken by a summation of this by the satirist Ben Uffendell on Twitter. And he summed it up this way, and it was really good. My message to those of you who hate these things, we were actively considering doing them. My message to those of you who like these things, we aren't doing them. Have a great day. It's the best or worst of both worlds here. And I just can't understand why Labour as a party and movement allowed itself to kind of lose its nerve, either in considering it or losing its nerve and actually going ahead with it.
Yeah, and given the talks that both Mark and I have had around the building, it seems pretty clear that Labour is going to actually put out its tax policy in this coming sitting block, so in the next fortnight it seems. Mark, talk us through that and sort of how we've got to this point and, how we got to, I guess, the sort of where Chris Hipkins sits on capital gains tax and wealth tax coming before the next bit.
Yeah, I think this is not the way that Labour really wanted to make this announcement about the capital gains tax and wealth tax. They've been sitting here for a bunch of weeks now being hammered by National, by ACT, and on the other side by the Greens for a position on a wealth tax and on the Greens' sort of tax and income policy. And Chris Hipkins has been very clear that, Labour is going to have their own policy. When they release that policy, we will see both what's included in it, but also what they're not going ahead with. But they've kind of had their hand forced a little bit this week because the budget documents had to be released within a certain time of the budget itself, and those documents had to include the consideration of the CGT and the wealth tax. So, they couldn't have been in a position where they said, we considered it, we didn't do it for the budget, we're not telling you what we're doing for the election. So they've gone ahead and said, okay, we're not going to take a wealth tax or a CGT to the election. But we now still have a couple of weeks, potentially, where they'll be hammered on, well, what are you going to take to the election? Labour's the only party in Parliament that hasn't got a proposal yet around tax relief for low-income New Zealanders, whether that's tax cuts, whether that's a tax-free threshold. It would be strange if they were the only one to run to the election without that sort of policy, but they're expensive, and so then the question becomes, how are you going to fund it?
Yeah, I think too the Green Party has come out, well, actually they've come out more strongly in their written statements than James Shaw actually ended up being in person at the stand-up, despite my best efforts to sort of try and get him to say something even slightly sort of annoyed. I think the word that he landed on that was the most sort of grumpy about it was that it was disappointing. So, I don't know what the game is there for the Greens because, they're not going to lose any votes in the sense that they've already put their policy out. They've been very clear about the fact that the capital gains tax and not getting it across the line when Jacinda Ardern was Prime Minister was like the most disappointing thing that happened for them in terms of that term of Parliament. They will pick up some Labour voters from this who, wanted to see some policy in this space. I guess James Shaw not going a little bit harder when, like I say, I don't think the Greens are going to lose any votes over it is an interesting move from them. And as you referenced as well, Tim, National's been fairly predictable in the way that it's responded as well, saying, Nicola Willis in particular has been saying, I was calling this. She's been asking questions of Grant Robertson in the House about where is the policy, what have you taken to Cabinet, I know something's gone to Cabinet, really pushing on this. And, they will beat them with it. Not in terms of necessarily the result, but certainly beat them like a stick with it during the campaign period and say, well, what are you actually going to do? Because of this backwards and forwards, getting advice, deciding not to do it, it does leave things a little bit messy and it's a little bit difficult for Chris Hipkins and Labour. But at the same time, this is clearly a captain's call. And, what Grant Robertson and David Parker, for instance, particularly think about all of this, given their own positions, personal positions and general positions within the party around tax, is interesting too. Tim, do you have any insights or any thoughts around that?
Well, only that, that you can't kind of tease, even internally, something like this and see it as a possibility worth consideration. And then sort of do the captain's call then. The captain's call ought to have been we either look at it or we don't. Not that we either do it or we don't. I think it needed to be right back then because it just lays the path for that national attack, that ACT attack, and the Greens too. To as you say, Joe, they'll get some votes out of this. Stepping back, like you said before, it's always wise to do. If you step back to 2020 and when Labour's big caucus first assembled at Parliament, if they'd, in their wildest bad nightmares, looked forward to a possible result that could be the worst case scenario, I don't think at 50% and 65 MPs that you could certainly think we'll burn some support. We will lose this. It's an anomaly. It's COVID. It's never happened before. We'll burn some support. The Greens and others will get some. National will win some back. That's the cycle. But you couldn't have imagined that they're at risk of losing a third of their MPs. So 20 of them, even at a good result at the moment, even at 35%, they're going to lose 20. And that's a sort of a good number in these polls. So is it the biggest kind of burning of political capital in modern history for New Zealand politics if we get this kind of result?
Yeah, I think also it's worth pointing out too, and Mark and I have had a conversation about this. I just think with Chris Hipkins being overseas, just coming back to the timing of it and the process, over at NATO doing the trade thing, it's bizarre timing. And I know that there's, things around you have to put out these budget releases and stuff in a certain period of time, but there's nothing to say that it couldn't be done next week. And sort of the arguments that have been made that, it's usually in recess and whatever, sure, but, you can move things by a couple of days. And when Chris Hipkins is the one who's made the call on this, and Chris Hipkins is quite clearly one of the best communicators and sort of articulators of why things are or aren't happening in that caucus at the moment, to have him sitting over in a time zone where he can't really answer questions about it is just a little bit bizarre to me, because I just think that with something this big that is potentially going to be such a problem area in the election campaign, you really, really need Chris Hipkins to be the one there explaining it. So very, very strange decision to release it while he's over at NATO.
You really want to sort of stick the landing on it, right? Because it's something that keeps hurting Labour election after election. Even Jacinda Ardern going to the 2020 election, having ruled out a CGT, the Greens announced a wealth tax, and they got hammered with it for weeks until just a few days before the election when she said, no, we're not going to do that either. We talked last week, Tim, about growing the left bloc and parties' sort of responsibilities for that. And it is quite difficult for the Greens to do that because their constituents are Green voters and Labour voters. But Labour can reach out into the centre. And maybe this move does grow the left bloc. You lose some Labour voters to the Greens, but you get some people in the centre who were maybe a bit unsure about the tax, unsure about Labour's ability to do the economy with a safe pair of hands. But that only works if you can really be convincing about it and make sure that you've done this announcement in a clear and concise and understandable way, and not sort of, left it a bit muddled with confusion with different people saying different things, that sort of thing.
Now, just because we like to do things a little bit differently at Raw Politics, we're going to look at something that's not necessarily been in the news, but we're interested in. So let's have a bit of a chat about how the deputies of National and Labour are doing. Of course, we're 3 months out from the election now, so it's a good opportunity to see how Carmel Sepuloni's been going in that acting Prime Minister role. She's had plenty of opportunity to do it because Chris Hipkins has sure spent a lot of time out of the country. And of course, Nicola Willis is, in that finance role as well as the deputy role with Chris Luxon. So a pretty interesting position for her, sort of balancing quite a big workload there. Tim, just coming to you first, how do you think that they are going? And, are Carmel Sepuloni in the House versus Nicola Willis in the House? Give us a bit of an insight into that.
I think Nicola Willis has come on greatly. And, I don't know her, but I observed her early, wasn't sure what she might bring to that combo and to this caucus and party. But I think as she's got more familiar with finance in particular, she's hitting some good shots, not just politicking, but some good points and some good arguments along the way. Not all, and not obviously all that anyone particularly agrees with at this podcast, but I think she's been effective and she's been good for Luxon, who has had his own moments when he's not been that convincing on some things, and she's been good. But Carmel Sepuloni, when she gets thrust into the politicking, I'm not talking so much now about policy and the various portfolios she has, and I think she's probably a pretty calm and pretty measured minister, but I think in the politicking it doesn't really come across much. And when she has to stand in for Chris Hipkins, and she's not doing her media round with the likes of Hosking and others, I just think she's not going to bring as much, or certainly not at this point, to that combo. When you move into the campaign mode, it's 3 months to go, 94 days or whatever it is. I just wonder about the capacity she brings for, their political manoeuvrings now.
Yeah, Carmel Sepuloni I found a little bit off this week, actually. Just a bit of context here, we've had a 57-page report that has come out on the Dawn Raid situation. Of course, we had that massive, well-publicised apology by Jacinda Ardern a couple of years ago to the Pacifica community over the Dawn Raids that took place in the 70s and 80s. We've then found out in the end of April that these sorts of tactics, these Dawn Raid practices were still taking place by Immigration New Zealand. And there was a pause that went on them. And in the meantime, a review's been done by King's Counsel Mike Heron. Now, that review came out this week and it was scathing, absolutely scathing. Said that the apology that had been made by Jacinda Ardern and the government rang hollow for the Pacifica community, that they had every reason to think that those sorts of tactics would have ended, and they hadn't. As we found out when this Tongan case came about at the end of April that found its way into the media. And you had, at the time that came out, you had both Michael Wood, the Immigration Minister, and Deputy Prime Minister Carmel Sepuloni saying, this shouldn't be happening. This is terrible. What was Immigration New Zealand up to? We weren't responsible for this. This is all on them. What we've now found out through this report from Mike Heron is that actually there was no advice, no memo, not even a simple phone call to Immigration New Zealand to tell them to change their operating procedures around these sorts of practices after that apology. And actually Mike Heron's made it pretty clear that the government stuffed up here. Interestingly, we've got a new immigration minister now, of course, in Andrew Little, with Michael Wood gone. And Andrew Little has apologised. He's expressed remorse, regret for the fact that Immigration New Zealand officials basically got thrown under the bus on this. And then you've had Carmel Sepuloni in that acting Prime Minister role across all of the media this week, blaming the immigration officials for not getting it right, which is in direct contrast with not only the report by the King's Counsel, but it's also in direct contrast with what Andrew Little has come out and said, who has the facts and the information and has talked to Immigration New Zealand about it. And I'm just kind of sitting here going, what information sort of advice is Carmel Sepuloni getting going into these media interviews? Or, because bearing in mind she is from the Pacifica community herself, is she unwilling to sort of accept that the government was at fault here? So is finding somebody else to blame, even though the report is very, very clear that the government got this wrong. And I just thought it shone an interesting light on Carmel Sepuloni this week and the way that she basically is choosing her own narrative on something that has been a really big public report this week. And it's just totally different to what other people are saying. Mark, I don't know whether you have any thoughts on, I guess, how Carmel's been going or any other examples with her or Nicola Willis in terms of their performance over the last few months or so?
Yeah, I think Carmel almost has the same problem as Christopher Luxon does in terms of a bit of difficulty being a generalist, command over a few subject areas, which she's had a long time handling. But when you're in that role of leader of the opposition or acting prime minister, you have to be ready for anything that comes your way. Chris Hipkins is good at that. Jacinda Ardern was very good at that, and in part because she really did learn a lot of depth across a lot of issues. Nicola Willis is also, like you said, Tim, kind of, getting across the finance portfolio, and as part of that, by necessity, learning a lot about everything else. And so you do see these scenarios where Nicola comes out to clean up for Christopher Luxon around comments like the having more babies thing, or the $5 charge being reinstated on prescriptions, also applying to contraception. Nicola Willis coming out and clarifying, this isn't a particular target at contraception. It's just for all pharmaceuticals in general. On the other hand, it'll be interesting to see whether Chris Hipkins or Andrew Little comes and sorts out clarifies the government's position on this Dawn Raids report, because we have heard two different things from two different people, both in positions of authority and seniority.
What do you both make of the relationship between the leaders and the deputy leaders? Like, if you look at Chris Hipkins and Carmel Sepuloni and their body language and the way they are with each other versus Christopher Luxon and Nicola Willis, Tim, any thoughts on those particular interactions?
Well, on both sides, necessity throws together these pairings, both caucus, party kind of thinking and so on. And sometimes it's done without political campaigning and the need to secure and go out and sell. It's so much as to keep the peace and to keep things stable and to just be a foil for someone such as Hipkins as they go out and try and change things and move with speed. So look, I think she may well be doing what they have wanted, Carmel, but you're right, Joe, she's not agile in the media sense. And this week, it was awkward for her because she was one of the main, personalities and figures at that solemn Crown apology, as she ought to have been with Sir William Seo and others. And for them to now find that their stance in front of their community was sort of undone by just a passive lack of activity or thought politically and departmentally, it must be devastating. On the other side, Luxon and Nicola seem to be coming together well. That's what was possibly unlikely and again forged for reasons in desperation back then, but they seem to have been coming together well, and she might give an edge, a quotable quote and a kind of a agility that he doesn't possess later.
I think just on that, Joe, in terms of the relationship, it's just worth remembering as well, Chris Hipkins and Carmel Sepuloni have shared a caucus together for many, many years, and they do have that established relationship. They were both part of Jacinda Ardern's sort of kitchen cabinet as well. And so, I think they're building on that foundation. On a personal level, they have quite close ties. I think, Christopher Luxon has been in Parliament this is his first term, doesn't have the depth of the relationship with Nicola, but like Tim says, I think, they're working well together.
Yeah, I think with Chris Luxon and Nicola Willis in particular, given the fact that they do have quite different views on particular issues. Obviously, Nicola being from that far more liberal end of the party and Chris Luxon, not necessarily the conservative end, but in some situations conservative end. You're kind of putting two people together who could not mesh well. And for the most part, they seem to be able to kind of get past the probably many differences that they do actually have.
We might have been spoiled having had pretty effective deputies for so long through Cullen and then Bill English, Grant Robertson, and getting to this point, and deputy leaders of opposition. We had Jerry standing last time with Judith Collins, and so there's a range of kind of performances. These guys may be in the middle of that, really.
Let's wrap things up with some recommendations, something you've watched, read or listened to this week that you have enjoyed. Mark?
I really enjoyed a piece on Newsroom by up-and-coming reporter Tim Murphy about Brooke Van Velden's running for the Tamaki seat against Simon O'Connor in Auckland. Just a detailed, in-depth explanation of the race and what seems like a long-shot bid.
And up-and-coming reporter Tim Murphy?
I really enjoyed an article on Axios, the US political and news website. It was an in-depth look at Biden behind the scenes in his administration and his personality. Revealed he's a sweary kind of, average politician probably, masking that as a sort of a sweet uncle, the old doddery uncle. But what took me especially was the headline that Axios put on it, which just was Old Yeller, Biden's private fury.
And my recommendation this week is that scathing 57-page report that I referenced earlier about the dawn raid tactics still taking place within Immigration New Zealand, written by, of course, King's Counsel Michael Heron. I think it's a really important read and a really important issue, and everyone should go have a look at that. We'll have the link for you at newsroom.co.nz. That's it from Raw Politics for this week. Thank you to our producer Hugo Stewart and our readers, listeners and watchers. If you have any burning questions for us, email them to me, jo.moyer@newsroom.co.nz. Thank you, Mark and Tim.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks.
You can find us next week, same time, same place, here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.